Do you ever feel like being a faithful person requires you to pretend like you're not angry or sad or overwhelmed? Like if you just had enough faith that you wouldn't feel those things. So because you're feeling them, then you must not really trust God, right? Or maybe when you're overwhelmed with hurt and heartbreak or fear or anger at everything that has gone wrong, you start to wonder, where is God in all of this? Why isn't He making this go away? Why do I feel this way? Why can't I just be happy? Doesn't God care about me? Doesn't God want me to be happy? Because if He loved me, doesn't He want me to be happy? And this is what we're talking about in our new series, Vibes. In this series, we're talking about our emotions and how the way that they shape the way that we think about God and the way that we think about our faith. Some of you might be rolling your eyes, getting ready to just scroll on, thinking, I didn't come here to talk about my feelings. I came here to learn about my faith. You might even have an idea that talking about feelings is for weak people. And you might feel like people just need to get their life together. Besides, like, you're here to grow your faith, not talk about all the feels. And if that's you, I want to encourage you to just hear me out. And that's because I used to think that way. I used to think that people just need to deal with their life and stop spending so much time like yammering on about how they feel, like just deal with it, just like move on, right? But as I grew, I came to understand that our emotions are totally normal and they're a totally healthy part of being a human being. Actually, a great deal of damage can be done by pretending that we don't have particular emotions because, of course, we have them. We're human. So if we're acting like we don't have them, that's exactly what it is. Acting. And it's not actually whether or not we have emotions. Having them is unavoidable. What matters is what kind of power we're giving to our emotions. That's what makes the difference. You know, we get a lot of messages in our world about what role our emotions should play in our lives. We often feel like we need to appear happy and joyful all the time, or no one will want to be around us. Right? Like, I feel like we've often gotten that message. And often men tend to get the message that expressing anger is allowed, but expressing pretty much any other emotion makes them look unstable or weak. But we all know that lots of problems are created in relationships if a man feels like the only emotion he can express is anger. Right? And women often get the message that if they express anger, then they're instantly unlikable. That they need to be softer and more gentle, but that there's a limit to that, right? Like, you better not cry too much, because if you cry too much, then you'll appear emotional. What we see here is that everyone, in an attempt to figure out their feelings, just ends up being shamed for having feelings. So we start to believe that, okay, well then I guess I'm not supposed to have any feelings at all, except for happiness, right? Like that's the one that's allowed. Otherwise, what I just need to do is just play it cool. Just play it cool, right? Like researcher Brené Brown defines cool as the need to be perceived as completely in control, completely certain, risking no emotional exposure at all. It's the straitjacket of I've got everything managed. It's emotional stoicism, not emotional exposure. And she says cool is really dangerous. Cool is dangerous because it is detached from what is going on in our hearts. Detaching from what is going on in your heart is dangerous. What's in our hearts matters. In fact, Jesus would tell us it's what matters most. So with this in mind, I want us to take a look at what Jesus has to say to a group of people about their feelings and as it pertains to their hearts. You can find this in Mark chapter 7, verses 20 through 23. It says, and then he added, it is what comes from inside that defiles you. For from within, out of a person's heart, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustful desires, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All these vile things come from within. They are what defile you. Jesus was talking to a crowd of people when he said this, and in that crowd of people were Pharisees and other teachers of the law. These were people who thought they knew exactly what they had to do to be right with God. They knew the law, they knew the rules that had been passed down to them from. They would have known these backwards and forwards, inside and out, right? And they thought that by living those rules, that's what would make them good and right with God. But Jesus talks about something totally different. He lived in a way that looked completely different than what the Pharisees thought it should, because they're focused on rule following. And Jesus is less concerned about what people are doing and, are you following the letter of this rule, of this law? And he's more concerned with what is going on in your heart. What's going on inside of you? That's what he's focused on. His message to them is the same as his message to us. We need to pay attention to what goes on in our hearts. This is why paying attention to our emotions is so important. Our emotions give us really good information about what is going on inside of our hearts. That's why Jesus started here by pointing out that there's so much more to our actions or our words. The long list of things that he talked about there, the evil thoughts, the pride, the foolishness, the deceit, the greed, all those things, he says, start from within. In other words, you've got to pay attention to what is going on in your heart, because those things are an overflow of what's in your heart, just like the good things are an overflow of what is in your heart. But if we're not paying attention to our feelings, if we're acting like they don't exist, then what we feel in our hearts is kind of going unregulated. And over time, it starts to take over and it starts to drive the way that we live. It starts to control what we do and what we say. And so because of that, we need to take our emotions seriously. We have to pay attention to how we feel, because how we feel often motivates how we act. Our moods come out of our words, our actions, our choices, and more. And we know this. I mean, how often do we experience others saying or doing hurtful and destructive things because they feel angry or they feel jealous or they feel hurt or lonely or sad? And so they do really harmful, destructive things. When we allow big feelings to drive our behavior, sometimes we end up doing really destructive things. We all want good relationships, right? Like thinking about, okay, so what's our goal? We want good relationships. But so often the hurt and destructiveness in our lives and in those relationships is caused by allowing our emotions to drive the way we live. So that begs the question, well, then what are we supposed to do with big emotions? What are we supposed to do when we feel really angry or really heartbroken or lonely or afraid or sad? What are we supposed to do? We go to Jesus. And that's not an overly simplistic answer. I want you to listen to how Jesus walks us through this. This is in Matthew chapter 11, verse 28. It says, "And then Jesus said, 'Come to me, all who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest.'" So I want us to talk about that verse for a second. It says, all who are weary and carry heavy burdens. That means for all of us that have a lot on our hearts. Like if you have a lot on your heart, we would describe that as being burdened. And that makes us weary. And don't we all have times where we just have a lot on our hearts? So what are we supposed to do? We come to Jesus. Jesus says, "Come to me." So when we're feeling something that is really intense, Jesus says, "Come to me." when we're feeling heartbroken or furious or overwhelmed or not feeling anything at all, Jesus says, come to him. When we're not sure if what we feel is okay, Jesus says, come to him. When we're feeling like our emotions are totally out of control or just difficult to wrap our heads around or making us act in a way that we don't typically act, Jesus says, come to him. Going to Jesus means we take that anger, we take that fear, that hurt, the uncertainty in our hearts, all the things that make our hearts feel weary and heavily burdened, and we take them to him. We ask Jesus to remind us of what is true. Remind us that there's hope. Remind us that he understands because he has lived the human experience. He's felt the things we feel. It's important to remember that Jesus lived the full human experience and experienced the full range of human emotions. When we read scripture, we see that Jesus experienced deep, painful grief and sorrow. He had immense joy in his life. He had times of feeling exhausted and frustrated and angry and compassionate and every other emotion in between. So when we bring our difficult, big emotions to him, we can trust he gets it. He cares. He's like, I know, I've felt that too. Going to Jesus also reminds us of the kind of people that we want to be. People that are loving and kind and have healthy relationships. So going to Jesus helps us make wise decisions through that lens. It helps us remind us of who we want to be, and that helps us to navigate our emotions with wisdom. It doesn't mean we don't have the emotions. It doesn't mean that it's bad to feel the emotions. It just means we don't let them call the shots. We don't let strong emotions dictate the way that we live. This is how we get better and better and healthier about how we navigate relationships through our emotions. Emotions are good, and they're a totally normal part of the human experience. That's why we see that Jesus has them. He's God himself, and he has them. Our emotions give us really good insight into what is going on in our hearts. That's why it's important to pay attention to them. However, we don't want to let those emotions drive our behavior. One of the best ways to understand how your emotions are showing you what's in your heart and to ensure that they are not driving your behavior is to get better at talking about your emotions. It's actually through talking about your emotions that you're able to connect with others. You see, if we're acting like we're cool, if we're acting like we don't have emotions, it robs us from being able to connect with other people. Because you see, cool turns to cold. And it is very difficult to connect with someone that has hardened their heart and become cold. Cool is not only overrated, but it's actually harmful to genuine connection with other people. Being able to communicate your emotions to others in a healthy way allows you to connect with their heart. You see, when we care less about looking like we don't have any emotions and we accept we do, but also accept that so does everybody else, that's what connects us to other people. And God wired us for connection. He wired us for deep, meaningful relationships. So talking about emotions allows us to connect. Pretending that we don't have emotions is not only false, but it also prevents us from being able to connect. My hope for you is that you will take your big emotions to God and trust him with them. Trust that he is compassionate and that he understands. Allow him to remind you of what is true. Let your emotions serve as really good information about what's going on in your heart, and then learn to navigate those emotions with others in healthy ways. Navigating our emotions well is how we become loving, open-hearted people that we were designed to be. People that are able to deeply connect and have meaningful relationships with others. That is God's heart.